My mother's text arrived at 7:42 p.m. Emergency. We need you at Bistro Loose right now. I abandoned my work, rushed across town through heavy rain, and practically burst through the doors of the upscale restaurant. But when I reached the table, there was no emergency. My mother, my stepfather, and my sister were sipping espresso, wiping dessert crumbs from their lips. My mother didn't even look up as she pushed a leather folder toward me. "You're late. Cover the bill, will you?" My sister snickered, still as clueless as ever. "How could you be late?" I checked my phone. The invitation hadn't been sent when the dinner started. It was sent the exact second their credit cards were declined. They hadn't invited me to celebrate their 30th anniversary. They had summoned a human ATM. But as the waiter approached, I noticed a tiny detail on that bill that changed everything. "My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the designated safety net for my family. If a tire blew out, if a bill was overdue, or if a crisis needed fixing, my phone was always the one that rang." That evening, I was sitting at my desk finishing up a financial analysis report when my phone vibrated against the wood. It was a text from my mother, Evelyn. The message was short, frantic, and printed in all caps. "Emergency. We need you at Bistro Loose right now." Panic instantly surged through me. Bistro Loose was an ultra-exclusive, 5-star restaurant downtown. Not the kind of place you'd associate with a sudden emergency. I abandoned my open laptop, grabbed my coat, and ran out into the pouring rain. I drove across town through heavy evening traffic, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight, picturing every worst-case scenario. Did my stepfather collapse? Had someone suffered a medical emergency? When I finally arrived, soaked from the rain and out of breath, I practically sprinted past the maitre d' toward the main dining room. But when I reached their table, there was no medical crew. There were no tears. Instead, I found my mother, my stepfather Richard, and my 28-year-old sister Chloe casually leaning back in velvet chairs. They were sipping expensive espresso, wiping the last bits of chocolate cake from their lips, and laughing among themselves. My mother glanced up, her eyes cold as she gestured toward a thick leather folder sitting on the tablecloth. "Oh, good, you're finally here. You're late. Cover the bill, will you?" Chloe let out a sharp snicker, adjusting her designer jacket. "Still as clueless as ever, Claire. How could you possibly be late to Dad and Mom's 30th anniversary dinner?" I stood frozen beside the table, water dripping from my coat onto the polished hardwood floor, staring at the three of them in utter disbelief. I stood there in silence as the warmth of the restaurant mockingly contrasted with the ice settling in my stomach. For years, this was how my family operated. I was the responsible daughter, the financial analyst with her life together, while my sister Chloe was the golden child who could do no wrong. I couldn't count how many times I'd been guilt-tripped into paying for Chloe's college textbooks, covering rent gaps for her artistic ventures, or picking up the tab for family vacations I hadn't even been invited to attend. Every time I tried to set a boundary, my mother would unleash a barrage of guilt. "We're family, Claire. Family supports each other. Don't be so cold." So out of habit, my hand reached into my purse for my wallet. But as I pulled out my phone to move funds from my savings account, my thumb brushed past the lock screen notifications. I stopped. My mother's frantic text had arrived at 7:42 p.m. I looked at the digital reservation clock on the restaurant's app displayed on my screen. Their reservation had been for 6 p.m. A 4-course meal for 3 at Bistro Loose takes at least an hour and a half to serve and finish. The math didn't lie. My mother hadn't sent that text when an emergency occurred. She had sent it the exact minute they finished their last bite of dessert. The whole frantic, panicked setup wasn't an afterthought. It was a calculated maneuver. They had planned this dinner weeks ago, intentionally excluded me from the celebration, ordered the most lavish items on the menu, dry-aged ribeyes, vintage wine, and artisanal desserts, and then summoned me at the final second to foot the bill. They expected me to be so flustered by the false urgency and public pressure that I'd just hand over my card without asking questions. They thought I'd pay $1,400 for a party I wasn't even invited to, just to avoid making a scene in front of wealthy strangers. I looked up from my phone, staring at my mother's expectant smile and my stepfather's calculated indifference. The naive, desperate to please daughter inside me finally went quiet. I opened the leather folder, not to pull out my credit card, but to examine the itemized receipt. At the very top, printed in bold ink, was a detail my family hadn't expected me to notice. Corporate account billing attempted. Beneath the running total of $1,412, there was a declined transaction slip featuring a corporate account name I recognized all too well, Vanguard Logistics, the firm where Richard worked as a senior VP. Beside it was a scribbled signature where Richard had already tried, and utterly failed, to authorize the charge. A cold smile touched my lips. I pulled out my phone and dialed the restaurant's front desk, keeping my eyes locked on Richard. "Claire, what on earth are you doing?" my mother hissed, leaning across the table, her voice a sharp, desperate whisper. "Put that away and just give them your card. You're making a scene." "Claire, stop being so dramatic for once," Chloe snapped, though her eyes darted nervously toward the front archway. "Just pay it so we can leave." Within 30 seconds, Mr. Harrison, the general manager, walked over to our table. He looked composed, but the strict posture of his shoulders signaled trouble. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Mr. Harrison asked, addressing me directly. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice calm and carrying clearly over the soft jazz playing in the dining room. "I was summoned here under the impression of a family emergency, only to find my family expects me to pay for a corporate transaction. Can you explain why this account was declined?" Richard's face drained of color so fast he looked ghost white under the dim chandelier light. He slammed his hands on the table, trying to stand. "This is a private family matter, manager. My stepdaughter will be settling the balance." "Actually, sir, it isn't private anymore," Mr. Harrison replied coldly, turning his attention to Richard. "As I informed you 15 minutes ago, Vanguard Logistics formally revoked your corporate card privileges as of 2 weeks ago following your termination from the company. Attempting to authorize over $1,400 on an inactive corporate account after your release constitutes fraud. If this bill is not settled immediately in cash or by a valid personal card, I am required by company policy to contact law enforcement." Evelyn gasped, clutching her pearls, while Chloe stared at her stepfather in absolute horror. The golden family facade hadn't just cracked, it had shattered into pieces. The arrogant smirks that my family had worn all evening evaporated in an instant. The silence at the table was suffocating. Richard slumped back into his velvet chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The news of his termination and the looming threat of handcuffs sent my mother into a spiral of blind desperation. The cold, condescending woman who had demanded I cover the bill just moments ago was gone. In her place was a frantic mess, reaching across the tablecloth to grab my wrist with trembling hands. "Claire, please," Evelyn begged, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. "You can't let them arrest your stepfather. Think of what this will do to our family. Think of the embarrassment. Claire, seriously do something." Chloe squeaked, her face red, practically hiding behind her napkin as nearby diners began to glance over at our table. "You have the money. Don't ruin our lives over a mistake." I looked at them, really looked at them, and felt no obligation, no guilt, and no fear. For the first time, I held every single piece of leverage. "I will settle the restaurant bill," I said, my voice sharp and loud enough to keep Mr. Harrison standing right where he was. "But not as a gift, and certainly not out of obligation. It will be a personal loan with strict, non-negotiable terms." I pulled a notepad and pen out of my work bag and laid a blank sheet on the table. "First, Richard will sign a legally binding promissory note to repay me the full $1,400 plus interest within 30 days. Second, Mom, you will sign a formal release relinquishing any control or claim over Grandma's inheritance trust, transferring full administration to me immediately." Evelyn gasped. "Grandma's trust? Claire, that's absurd." "Then Mr. Harrison can call the police," I replied calmly, turning toward the manager. "Give him 5 seconds to decide." "Wait, don't call anyone," Richard stammered, grabbing my pen with shaking fingers. He didn't even read the fine print. He signed his name at the bottom of the page, his breath coming in shallow hitches. My mother, cornered and terrified of the public fallout, grabbed the pen next and scribbled her signature right beside his. They had spent years trapping me with emotional manipulation. Tonight, I trapped them with paper and ink. I took the signed agreement, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my coat pocket. Then, I handed my credit card to Mr. Harrison. He processed the transaction smoothly, handed me the receipt, and offered a respectful nod. I added a generous $200 tip for the waitstaff who had dealt with my family's entitlement all evening, grabbed my bag, and turned toward the exit. "Claire, wait," my mother called out, her voice raspy as she scrambled to her feet. "Where are you going? How are we supposed to get home? Richard's card is blocked, and we didn't take a cab." I paused at the front entrance, looking back at them one last time. "That sounds like a practical matter for the three of you to figure out. You have phones. Figure it out." I walked out into the cool rain, leaving them stranded inside Bistro Luce, without a single dollar to their names. The fallout was swift. Within 2 weeks, my lawyer used the sign release form to bypass my mother's illegal hold on my late grandmother's trust. It turned out Grandma had left me $85,000 intended for my future, which Evelyn had been secretly trying to siphon off to cover Richard's mounting debts. Thanks to that night at the restaurant, every penny of my inheritance was safely transferred to my private account. When Richard failed to make the first payment on his promissory note 30 days later, I didn't hesitate. I turned the note and the documentation of his corporate card fraud over to a collections attorney. Faced with legal action, Richard was forced to liquidate his vintage car collection just to pay me back with interest. Today, I live in a quiet seaside town miles away from their drama. I cut off contact with all three of them, changing my number and moving on with my life. They thought they were summoning a helpless target to pay for their luxury meal, but they ended up paying for a lifetime of greed. Setting boundaries didn't cost me my family. It finally bought me my freedom.